What's up, guys? So in this video, I'm going to be talking about some coded in secret historical dates that are in the book. What I'm going to be using for these dates is basically the secret LA and New York puzzles. There are 3 in each. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you should go back and watch the videos that I posted on the secret puzzles. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how to decipher these historical dates from what we have gathered in these pictures. These dates may not make sense at first, but at the end of all these videos, I'm going to connect the dots and you're going to see how they all relate. So in the first picture that has to do with the puzzles 13 and 14, I'm going to be referencing the picture on the verses. In this picture, we have 25 of the fair people. And in these 25 clues, we actually have 26 solutions. And that has to do with the right wing simp and the left wing trog. So knowing that there are 26 solutions with 25 puzzles, we're going to match that up to a particular time frame, and that is going to be 2625 BC, and that coincides with the time of Imhotep. And Imhotep was a renowned Egyptian polymath, chancellor to Pharaoh Dozier, and high priest of Ra at Heliopolis. If you remember, I mentioned something about the Vanderbilts transporting a obelisk from Heliopolis, and that's called Cleopatra's Needle. So kind of interesting that Imhotep was a high priest at Heliopolis previously, and he is thought by some to be the author of the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a scientific medical treatise, and widely recognized as a pioneering physician. He was associated as the god of medicine and healing, and eventually he was equated with Thoth, the god of architecture, mathematics, and medicine. And there is something called Hermes Trismegistus, if you want to look up that phrase, but that has to do with Thoth and Hermes combined. Also, the Greeks associated Imhotep with Asclepius, who was the god of health for the Greeks. I talked a little bit about a rod of Asclepius previously. And I wanted to point out that on the Scottish Rites Temple in LA, there's actually a statue of Imhotep. And here we have a clear version. It says Imhotep at the bottom, and you could see Imhotep here with the pharaoh. So we could see that Imhotep is actually an important person in Scottish Freemasonry. Otherwise, they wouldn't have built a statue of him on the side of their building. So 2625 will be that of Imhotep. The next clue I'm going to talk about is from 15 and 16. We have 20 clues in those pictures. In the 13 and 14, we had 26 clues and 25 pictures. These are not in order, and I just listed them as I found them and solved them. But if this was going to be in order, 20, I'm going to relate this to the 20th century BC, or that's also the second millennium BC. And this is going to be the time called the Patriarchal Age. And this is the era of the 3 biblical patriots, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And these guys are basically responsible for modern day religions such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. These guys are basically the founding fathers of the biggest religions that we have today. And you can see here that it talks about how Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob most likely would have existed sometime in the second millennium BCE between 2100 and 1500 BC. These dates vary between researchers based on what they found, but the Bible provides specific dates relating to King Solomon's temple and Exodus as how they were able to solve this. If you want to read more into it, the Patriarchal Age is what it's called. But during this time frame is when Jacob and his family would have moved to Egypt. Abraham would have existed, Isaac would have existed. So that is going to be the Patriarchal Age. The next clue I'm going to be talking about is 13 clues, which comes from the LA and New York clues with the 2x and the x1. There are 13 clues in here, and if we were to relate that to something that happened in history, I would say that this would have to do with the Exodus. And the Exodus is when Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. And you can see here that it talks about the Exodus specifically in several of the 5 books of the Pentateuch. Or it's in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And if you've ever seen the movie The Ten Commandments by Cecil B. DeMille with Charlton Heston playing Moses, you know the story basically. And if we were to just look it up as far as a specific time frame, we could see that the Exodus is believed to have happened either in the 15th century BCE or the 13th century BCE. The 15th century one is based on a date used for the construction of Solomon's temple, but the 13th century is based on archaeological evidence and the mention of the city of Ramses, which in the Ten Commandments movie, you talk a lot about Ramses and whatnot, so that seems to be something more in line with what we're looking at, plus the archaeological evidence. So the 13th century is during the time of Moses and the Exodus. So just to make things flow a little smoother, I put 15 and 16 above the 2x, x1, just to make things a little easier to understand. Now we're going to come back around to the main numbers 7 and 6, which will mainly be dealing with the 7th century BC and the 6th century BC. It is a wide range of dates here, but we're going to focus mainly on a couple that happened later in the 7th century BC, which is basically 700 BC all the way to 601 BC. So in the 1660s BC, we're going to see that Nineveh, the capital of Syria, becomes the largest city in the world. And if we look at the Assyrian symbol, you could see that it's very similar to that of the Zoroastrian symbol. In 647 BC, the Assyrians sacked Susa, and we had a mention of Susa in the book. That Susa was a musician. This Susa is actually a city, and Susa was a very wealthy city in the ancient Near East, which was part of the Achaemenid Empire. And you could see that Darius had a palace here. We'll be talking about Darius just a little bit later. Then eventually the Neo-Babylonian Empire starts revolting against Assyria in 626 BC. In 622 BC, there is a text of Deuteronomy found in the Temple of Jerusalem, which is basically Solomon's temple. In 612 BC, a coalition of the Medes, Babylonians, and the Susians besiege and conquer Nineveh. So they kill the king of Assyria during that time. In 612 BC, Babylon, the capital of Babylonia, becomes the largest city in the world, overtaking that of Nineveh. In 609 BC, the Babylonians defeat the Assyrian army, and the last Assyrian king disappears from history when they do that. In 605 BC, the Babylonians, led by Crown Prince Nebuchadnezzar, defeats the army of Necho II in Egypt and basically secures the Babylonian conquest of Assyria. And this is the time the Babylonians become the ultimate power in the Middle East. And 600 BC, Nebuchadnezzar builds the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Now we're going to move into the 6th century BC, which is basically 600 BC to 501 BC. In 597, the Babylonians capture Jerusalem. In 587, for sure, Jerusalem falls to the Babylonians, and the Babylonians destroy the Temple of Solomon. And this is when the Jews begin their Babylonian captivity. In 570 BC, we have Pythagoras of Samos. That's when he is born. Pythagoras, somebody we've seen several times. In 551 BC, a very famous person, Confucius, was born. We'll see Confucius a little later. In 539 BC, Babylon is conquered by Cyrus the Great. And then the next year, some of the Jews who were put into a Babylonian exile are allowed to return to Jerusalem, and they build the second temple 50 years after the destruction of the first. And this happens between 520 BC and 516 BC. In 528 BC, the Buddha attains enlightenment and begins his ministry founding Buddhism in India. In 521 BC, Darius the Great ascends to the throne and becomes the ruler of Persia. And in 515 BC, we talked real briefly already, the construction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem is completed. And later in 501 BC, we see Confucius appointed governor of Chengdu. But this is the main things that happened in the 6th century BC. I know that was kind of a lot, but the 7th and 6th century BC will be pretty important to the things we talk about later. So now the rest of the dates are actually going to be singular years, no more centuries. The next one is going to be 212 BC, and during this time, one major event happened that has to do with what we're talking about, and that was the death of Archimedes of Syracuse, who was a Greek mathematician and scientist. He died in a siege in Syracuse. Archimedes was a Greek mathematician, physicist, engineer, astronomer, and inventor. Some of his accomplishments were he anticipated modern calculus and analysis by applying the concept of infinitesimals and method of exhaustion to derive and rigorously prove many geometrical theorems. And one of his other accomplishments was deriving an approximation of pi. The Babylonian mathematics used pi for architectural projects of the time, notably also reflected in the description of the Temple of Solomon. And the clue of the calculus is probably something that would relate to Archimedes as well, since he anticipated modern calculus. Now the dates we're going to be using are all AD dates, and the first one is going to be 2727. And in the year 27 AD, where John the Baptist begins preaching in the Jordan, and it's also likely that Jesus was baptized by John in the final months of the year before his temptation and the first 3 Passovers listed in the Gospel of John. So this is when Jesus was baptized, and soon after, John the Baptist was imprisoned, and a few years later, he was executed and beheaded. Now, the next date has to do with the New York and Los Angeles puzzles put together, plus 17 through 20. I'm not going to talk about those. All I will say is that LA is 3, NY is 3, and then the other stuff is 43. If you were to take those numbers 3343, you would actually get a specific date in the year 33 AD, and that would be April 3rd of 33 AD. And it's an important date, and this is when historians believe that the Last Supper takes place, and it is also believed that Jesus of Nazareth is crucified on this day and he dies. So, because it's an important date, I want to share that one with you. The next year I'm going to be talking about is 67 AD. And this was a year that several things happened, but mainly this is the time of the First Jewish-Roman War, also known as the Great Jewish Revolt or the Jewish War. During this time, Jerusalem was sacked, the Second Temple of Solomon or the Jerusalem Temple was destroyed. That happened in the year 70 AD, but it all has to do with the Jewish-Roman War. Many Jewish inhabitants were massacred, such as the siege of Yodfat. 40,000 inhabitants were massacred at one time, and many people were killed. Also, the apostles Peter and Paul are martyred in Rome. The next date I'm going to use is 75 AD, which comes from the 75 total fair people and clues. It is the Temple of Peace is built, and it's also known as the Forum of Vespasian. It's built in Rome, and the temple celebrates the conquest of Jerusalem in AD 70 and houses the menorah from Herod's temple. And there's actually a relief on the Arch of Titus. This is actually in Rome. If you ever visit Rome, there is an arch that actually has this on the top of it, and this is a depiction of the Romans looting the Jerusalem temple, also known as Herod's temple, and taking the menorah and other artifacts from it. But 75 AD was right after the conclusion of the First Jewish War, so it kind of encapsulates from the time of the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem to where all the artifacts went to. The next year I'm going to talk about is 128 AD. And in this year, there's one thing in particular that stands out as happening, and that is the Pantheon in Rome is completed. Now, the Pantheon literally means in ancient Greek the temple of all the gods. And in 609 AD, it was turned into a Catholic church and renamed the Basilica of St. Mary and the Martyrs. But for a while, it was a temple that was dedicated to all the gods. Very interesting that they changed it to St. Mary later on, but everybody still knows it as the Pantheon. And one interesting thing about the Pantheon that would relate to the secret is that the floor plan of the Pantheon actually looks very similar to the design of the front cover of The Secret. And if you look at the back cover, it looks even more exact, which is pretty strange that the Pantheon, aka St. Mary's, would have the same shape and structure of what appears to be the Pantheon. And if you compare it a little more to the front cover, around the woman's head, the oculus, how the design is very similar to that of the Pantheon. And then the lower half also is cut into 3 different pieces, one where the bird is, one in the middle, and the other third is right here as well. Also, it has a very similar design as to what the Pantheon would be. And you can see if you place it over the back, the Pantheon fits that keyhole in the back cover. And if you superimposed it on the front cover, it looks like it fits pretty snugly there as well. The next year I'm going to talk about is 197 AD. And this year is a little ambiguous as to things that happen, but there are 2 things that I wanted to point out. The first one being a man named Galen. His major work on medicines called Pharmacologia is published. And Galen was a Roman and Greek physician, surgeon, and philosopher. He was considered to be one of the most accomplished of all medical researchers of antiquity, and he influenced the development of various scientific disciplines, including anatomy, physiology, pathology, pharmacology, and neurology, as well as philosophy and logic. Also, in the year 197 AD, there was a book published called Apologeticus, and Apologeticus was attributed to Tertullian, who was a prolific early Christian author from Carthage. He was the first Christian author to produce an extensive corpus of Latin Christian literature and was an early Christian apologist and a polemicist against heresy, including contemporary Christian Gnosticism. Tertullian was the first theologian to write in Latin, and so has been called the father of Latin Christianity, as well as the founder of Western theology. And he's most famous for being the first writer in Latin known to use the term Trinity. Nowadays, the Holy Trinity seems to be something heavily used in Christianity and Catholicism, so pretty important to note that. The next date I'm going to be using comes from right here. When you break down the 6 clues for the LA puzzle 2x, it basically comes out to 11113. And if you were to put this into an actual date, that would be more along the lines of January of 1113. And something important happened in January 1113, and that is the Order of Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, also known as the Knights Hospitaller, was founded to protect pilgrims to the Holy Land and is formally recognized by the papal bull proclamation Pie Postulatio Voluntatis issued by Pope Paschal II. So this is kind of the beginning of military orders of the Crusades. The next few dates I'm going to talk about come from the New York puzzle, puzzle 16. And if we break down the 8 clues in that, it's basically 1311, 1313. And if you square those up to the year 1311 through 1313, a lot of important things happened. In February, we could see that there was a Milan uprising, and some of the Teutonic Knights, who were some of the order of knights of the Crusades, were very active and they helped quell a rebellion. On April 27th, Pope Clement V convened a Council of Vienne to determine whether Pope Boniface was guilty of heresy, and he excused King Philip IV, also known as Philip the Fair, from France of any condemnation of Boniface. On October 16th, at the Council of Vienne, Pope Clement V declares that the Order of Knights Templar should be dissolved and confiscate their lands and label them as heretics. In the year 1312, it's a very busy time for King Robert the Bruce. If you've ever seen the movie Braveheart, you kind of have an idea who Robert the Bruce was, although the story between him and William Wallace wasn't exactly accurate. But Robert the Bruce was very active during this time. He took a castle on February 7th of 1312, Dumfries Castle. On March 22nd of the year 1312, Clement V, under pressure from Philip IV of France, officially disbands the Order of Knights Templar at the Council of Vienne, issuing the bull Vox in Excelso. The order's property and monetary assets are given to a rival order, the Knights Hospitaller. Meanwhile, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, is held in prison where he is forced to commit false confessions. On May 6th of 1312, the Council of Vienne is ended, and all they did was really outlaw the Knights Templar. And a historian, John of St. Victor, writes that it was said by many that the council was created for the purpose of extorting money. During the 13th through 15th centuries, the church was a little bad at extorting money or finding ways to extort money from people. We might talk about that later. And at the end of the year, December 23rd of 1312, Pope Clement V elevates 9 bishops, all French, to the position of Roman Catholic cardinals. This starts the French papacy, basically where the Pope remained in France, no longer in Rome, almost until the end of the 13th century, and they became fairly corrupt at that time. Moving on to the year 1313, Robert the Bruce captures Perth Castle. February 3rd, we have a man named William de Santo Claro. He was somebody who was part of the church, but we'll talk about his family a little later. On May 17th of 1313, Robert the Bruce leads an invasion of the Isle of Man, and he captures the castle Russian. In October of 1313, Robert the Bruce delivers an ultimatum asking for people to swear fealty to him or lose their estates. This leads to some Scottish nobles asking the English for protection. And I'll continue with the year 1314 just because it has a lot to do with the last 3 years. On March 18th of 1314, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, along with several others, by the orders of King Philip IV of France, were burned at the stake in front of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. When Jacques de Molay was burned at the stake, his one request was actually to face the Notre Dame Cathedral so he could pray. And it's kind of interesting. We'll talk a little bit about Notre Dame in Paris afterwards, but during this time, he declares his innocence and that of the Templar Order, and he also predicts or foreshadows that both Philip IV and Clement V will die within the year, and both of them do. In June 23 and 24 of 1314, we have the Battle of Bannockburn, which is where Robert the Bruce and his Scottish forces pretty much beat the English and secure their de facto independence for Scotland. This is kind of talked about in the movie Braveheart. Also, on April 20th of 1314, Pope Clement V dies. And on November 29th, Philip the Fair, Philip IV, dies in a hunting accident. So, as Jacques de Molay said, both of them will die within the year. You have to wonder if maybe there was some kind of outside intervention here, and both of these people possibly could have been assassinated for what they did. So, those are the main points of things that happened in the 1311 through 1314 time frame. The next date I'm going to talk about is 3/14/1319, which is March 14th of 1319. And this is a very important date because this is when the Military Order of Christ is established in Portugal by King Denis of Portugal after Pope John the 22nd issues the papal bull Adia ex Quibus. The new order is the revival of former Knights Templar who had aided the Kingdom of Portugal in its post-war reconstruction. So even though the Knights Templar were dissolved, different countries and different kings were finding ways around this. And here you could see in Portugal that the Knights Templar were just renamed the Military Order of Christ. The last date I'm going to talk about in this video is 1407. And if you put a 0 in front of the 7, you can see it's just 1407. But in 1407, this is when the Teutonic Order reached its greatest territorial extent, encompassing Prussia, Pomerania, Samogita, Courland, Livonia, Estonia, Gotland, Dago, Osel, and the Neumark. This year marked a critical transition in leadership and policy, just 3 years before the Order's decisive defeat at the Battle of Grunwald. So the Teutonic Knights were one of the military orders who fought in many crusades. They were there at the Battle of Acre, and this was the height of their power. After this, they declined steadily. 1407 was a time for the Teutonic Knights. I could talk about other dates such as 1512 and 1608, but I will talk about these time frames in another video that has to do more with history. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed the historical context and dates hidden in the secret puzzles, and I'll talk to you about some religious context that are hidden in here as well.